Okay, next news story, and well, as usual, Switch 2 is dominating the headlines, but we've actually got some original content here for you. We did put out a hands-on on Cyberpunk 2077, and we did put in some questions to CD Projekt Red. Those answers didn't come through in time for the hands-on that we did last week, but we do now have confirmation that Cyberpunk 2077 on Nintendo Switch 2 is indeed using DLSS. And actually, I'm going to read out the quote that I got back from PR. And the quote is, "We're using a version of DLSS available for Nintendo Switch 2 hardware, powered by NVIDIA's Tensor Cores. The game utilizes DLSS in all 4 modes, in handheld and docked, and the performance and quality variations of each." Now, I've put in some more questions to CD Projekt Red in the wake of this, but obviously with this revelation, we should be going back and looking back at the assets to see, why we didn't see it. Are we actually seeing DLSS? Is this a form of DLSS that we aren't recognizing simply because we typically don't look at DLSS in such a low resolution? Or is it the legendary light version of DLSS that Nintendo's patents are kind of hinting about? Alex, now, you have got access to the press quality asset for Cyberpunk 2077 from the Direct, and you spent some time looking at it in a bit more depth, right?
Right. And the basic thing I can say is that there are a lot of confounding factors looking at this footage to say, oh, yes, this is DLSS. And Rich already talked about one, that we don't typically look at DLSS running at very low resolutions at 1080p. That's actually not the typical thing we look at on the channel. But even in spite of that, I've played games with low res 1080p DLSS before, just checking it out, and it's a lot harder in this footage as well too to figure out what's going on visually due to a lot of other aspects of the visuals in Cyberpunk on Switch 2 as of this press trailer footage, at least, is done at sub-native and sub-internal res too. You can see that there's the one part where they're showing that walkway along the edge in, I think it's called Dogtown area. They're showing it like a kind of sunny type of day there. And if you look at the particles on what looks like a crashed container ship in the background, you can see they have massive alias blocks in them that are, quite literally, Super Nintendo styled. So
Wow.
they're doing things like lower res particle effects. That's a pretty common thing to do in games, as well as things like motion blur and depth of field are also quite a lot lower resolution than the internal normal rasterized G-buffer resolution. And as a result of that, a lot of those edges actually show up in the footage constantly, and they obscure the edges that DLSS is producing. So when I look for a DLSS edge in a game, DLSS actually doesn't produce normal aliased edges almost ever. What it does do is it'll take that aliased edge and it'll try and fix it up almost like FXAA would, but it does it in this wavy line type of way. The CNN model did, at least. And here, due to all those confounding factors, as well as the slow moving camera in a lot of scenes, it's pretty hard to find any of those lines. But one thing, as I can say, there's a point when there's a procession at there's these Asiatic lamps, and there's the goldfish in the background. That's a hologram. I forget exactly which area of Cyberpunk this is in, but there's these the lamps there between these poles, etc. The poles there, they do have actually that kind of wobbly edge that I expect from DLSS. But the rest of the footage, it's harder to find those kind of edges. For example, when the character's moving along there on the motorbike at the one section, a lot of those edges there would typically have that kind of bug in them. But here, due to the extremely low quality motion blur that is on, it's actually obscuring all those edges pretty much all the time. And instead, you're getting full aliased edges, which is not what you'd get with DLSS. Another thing to say is that there are a couple moments where I can say at least this isn't FSR2, because when characters move their arms, you don't get the typical disocclusion fizzle. Which is something, you could technically not have that with TAA. But that would be another thing that points to, yeah, this footage here is using DLSS in that aspect. But a lot of the other things that I would usually expect to see from DLSS here, CNN model, I'm also not seeing. For example, any of the other visual bugs that it can cause occasionally. But that's probably down to the lack of variety in the footage and just how fast this footage is. So
Right. Yeah, fair enough. It's interesting that you're talking about the post-processing being of a lower resolution, because typically with DLSS, it's rendered at native resolution, native output resolution, those effects, right?
yeah.
That's how, why DLSS, it's not actually always upscaling from a lower native resolution. There are certain elements that will just look poor if you upscale them. And we've got the reverse here. They're actually of a lower resolution. That the resolution isn't going up for that post-processing, it's going down. Which is, of course, a time-honored bandwidth-saving trick that I first saw in like the Xbox 360 PS3 generation.
Yep.
But it still persists even today, as we're seeing here. Okay, so I did get back to CDPR with a few more questions, perhaps too many, but surprisingly, I did get some interesting results back from that email. First of all, confirmation on the performance and quality settings. There are indeed performance and quality settings targeting 30 FPS and 40 FPS for both handheld and docked configurations. This may have been reported elsewhere, but they're all 1080p, except for the handheld performance mode, which is targeting 720p 40. That's quite interesting. However, is it actually 1080p and 720p, or is DRS in play, as we saw from the footage? And the answer is that, yes, DRS is in play, quite obviously. They don't want to go into specifics here, except they did say that scaling can range from 2x and up per axis, which effectively confirms that it's going to be a 540p to 1080p range for those 1080p modes, and it'll be like 360p to 720p on that 720p 40 handheld. So yeah, so interesting new data there. Kind of explains how an ambitious game like this is going to be running on, such a resource-constrained device. Interesting stuff. I think, Oliver, you highlighted some footage from one of the hands-on sort of videos that you saw on YouTube.
Yes.
Kind of highlights that, yeah.
Yeah, someone, again, Nintendo has these various capture requirements that require you to be so far away from the screen and things like this, but they have a pretty dead-on shot of the screen. I don't know how they're able to do that. Maybe they cropped in a high-res video or something, but in any case, they
8K,
have this, they have this like super tight crop of the handheld screen. They're playing Cyberpunk. They're playing some interior areas, and you're seeing a lot of breakup there. It's not super clean like you might expect with DLSS sometimes. So that threw me a little bit for a bit of a ride, and I'm like, does that look like DLSS? Maybe so, maybe not. But again, Alex has pointed out the low-res post-processing, which makes a lot of sense here in terms of giving you a more compromised final visual result. That's obviously not what NVIDIA advises, but when you have such a low-power handheld here, maybe that's the only route you can reasonably go in order to get DLSS working at a performant level. But unfortunately, that does mean compromising image quality. I remember the compromised post-processing resolution in a title like Alan Wake 2 kind of destroyed image quality on consoles using FSR2 upscaling. So I'm surprised. Well, I'm not surprised, but it doesn't feel to me like maybe the ideal optimization if you're just going to be slathering the screen in low-quality, low-res motion blur. But now I am thinking of going back through all of our assets to look for DLSS now. But I think in most cases, actually, it was fairly evident that DLSS wasn't in use, just because even in still shots for some games, we're getting quite a lot of aliasing. And obviously the Nintendo first-party titles seem to be using a mix of maybe some post-A, no A in some cases, right? So there are pretty clear cases where we can say there's no DLSS, but there are probably a couple titles that I can think of where maybe we should do a little bit more looking into those titles and see if there actually is a stronger case to be made for DLSS in those games.
Like I said on the podcast a while back, I think Hitman would be another candidate, but that was one where the footage was once again kind of like this. It wasn't super great for examining these kind of things. If I could play a game in front of myself, I could probably identify it pretty well, actually. Especially if I could turn off motion blur. That's the easiest way to find out almost anything about image quality.
Yeah, I think we should give a shout out to the guy who did the hands-on footage. It's the channel is called Deck Wizard. I'll try to remember to put a link in the video description. I always say it and always forget. But yeah, I mean, he's got such a close-up view here that you can actually see like the stair-stepping artifacts and stuff like that. And it's a really good quality feed, gives a really good indication of how Cyberpunk displays on the handheld, as I saw it pretty much. Just doesn't have any of the kind of stress test stuff that we did with our hands-on. But yeah, definitely worth checking that footage out. You get a really good indication of how the game actually looks when it's running reasonably well, I think, overall.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I think this DLSS story for Switch 2 is going to continue to run and run. And it's perhaps slightly sort of disappointing that Nintendo isn't the kind of company that does tech disclosures about, the tools within its development kit. And it's interesting that CD Projekt Red are basically referring to it as a version of NVIDIA DLSS that's, for Nintendo Switch 2. So are they hinting that it's a different version of DLSS built specifically for the handheld? I don't think we're going to find out for a good while, but I'm certainly curious about the whole thing.